everyone. I'm B. I'm hosting this talk. We're probably not going to have time for Q&A afterward, but thank you all for being here. And this is the last 20 minutes of a movie with Everest Pipkin. And yeah, thank you.
We can have an aspirational Q&A. I just know myself is really where it is. It says 20 minutes of a movie, but it's 30 minutes of a talk for sure. Okay, so I'm Everest. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm a game designer. I'm an artist. I'm currently masquerading as an academic and not just a teacher, which I always am, but I am primarily and not exclusively thinking about and working on internet-based projects. Some past work of mine includes the self-playing apocalyptic town simulation Linger, Texas, where kind of these drifts of forgotten asset store objects emergently form town folk-like NPC behaviors over the course of a month of kind of real-time play, or the body horror, a biogenesis idle clicker, the barnacle goose experiment, which is about a researcher doing combinatorial recipe-based science out of the elements of their own body, or Anonymous Animal. Shout outs to the HTML review for those who were at that talk. They published that. The iframe-driven kind of like curated walk through a series of websites, which are unloaded and loaded together on a synced clock. I keep up a number of tools and resources and directories and guides and spreadsheets. So if you're someone who likes weird tools, you've maybe ended up on one of those spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are a labor of love. But most applicable to the rest of this talk, the tabletop games like the two-person conversational game, The Cloister, the deep time world building game, The Ground itself, or the book I'll be pulling apart for like the next 20 odd minutes, World Ending Game, a supplement that is made specifically to serve as the last session of a campaign in any system. So, okay. I'm not a hater. I really am not. Big ups to everyone against the perhaps present current of the culture, right? Which is world building games. World building is fun. World building is IP development. World building is practice. World building is praxis. Asterisk. World building's really jumped into the mainstream this year. I have made world building games. I'm not above it. I think it's because I've built them that I've ended up in this place. I'm here actually to talk about ending stories. Which is to say why and how to end those worlds that we've so enthusiastically spun up. And these are worlds that are kind of could be created expressly through a world building game or a world exercise, or worlds that were made through more traditional or writing or development practices, or worlds made somewhat ambiently through presence and attention over dedicated time. So this is a short talk. I've only got a half hour. So we're just gonna get like right into the thing, which is like why finding the end of a story and actually ending it is important. There's a number of arguments here, right? We have the personal argument, which is like, yeah, there's like something really special about turning the last page of a book, exiting a theater, clapping at the end of the play, ending the bedtime story, saying goodnight to your kid, moving away, having a last bite of dessert, right? Having the perfect last bite of dessert, not just like the last bite of dessert, but like the last bite. Finishing a project, finishing school, growing up, just growing, right? Growing is a kind of an ending. And then you also have the narrative argument, right? Reaching an ending is what kind of allows a story to click, to like settle into itself. There's this final alignment thing that can happen at the end of a story where all of a sudden the characters, the motifs, everything that we've been living in for the past however many years often of your life all of a sudden aligns. We'll talk more about that later. We have the intellectual property argument, right? Not every world really wants to become an expanded cinematic universe. Want to become IP, right? Kill it before it can happen. And then you also have the writer's argument, which is like sometimes you need to know where you're headed before you can get there. So this is this great quote from John McPhee, who is a nonfiction writer of geology, among a number of other things, about like the horror of having blank where to go from the ending. But you know, writing towards the ending is classic literary and filmic advice. Know your ending, right? With your characters and objects and setting in motion, you work your way towards the ending that you know you're reaching for. It is obviously not the only way to write. There are many different ways to write. Different writers have their own. But on balance, right? It's a good kind of like, I'm lost, I don't know where I'm going, figure out the end. It's the advice I give my own students often. You should know where you're headed so you can kind of feel your way there. Find your beginning, find the last image, and then you can kind of work out the middle and process between those 2 points. This is especially prescient, I think, when stories are trying to align themselves to a more classic model of literature or film. So this tends to lend itself to a real rhyming structure. You have this end that mirrors the beginning, right? These motifs circle. You have the questions that are asked in the setup, which are answered by the conclusion. This is classically called a closed ending in film. These are, I would say, somewhat hated by many film scholars, but it's useful. It can really arrange your middle. But even when you're breaking from this chart, yeah, thank you. Or even this chart. I always wanted to do that. Thank you, very, very happy. Even when you're breaking from those structures in favor of employing non-traditional structures, non-traditional time or folk traditions or non-traditional story patterns or different types of layouts or motivating forces or loops or twists, pivots or abrupt cuts, or simply different ways of thinking about story than beginning, end, at some point, the actively telling the story stop and the after hearing the story start, even if you are engaged in a type of story structure that doesn't engage with beginnings, middles, ends traditionally, where there is no end time at the end of the story. You move from active listening to having listened. And this sort of pointed winnowing ending is the particular kind of cinematic power that's really what makes movies, right? It's that last shot, it's that little click that we talked about that kind of resettles the story. It's that uncertainty kind of thrown right in the end, cut, that lets us go like, whoa, okay, it's over. Like, I have to make sense of this world now. And this moment is what has made ending studies a field within literary and media studies. Although perhaps one that gets like less love than many subfields in the media studies on account of its specificity. So many of those studies do actually move from the 3-act structure chart as a baseline, although I think they are on balance really critical of its universality as well. But like all pieces of media that are studying pieces of media that are built off of an understanding of not like all stories, but or should work, but rather like what's become mainstream, which is like this chart. This vision of rising and falling action is like present in these kinds of studies. So in film in particular, and we'll be focusing on film more than kind of any other from here out, there are often like 2 types of filmic endings that happen in sequence. So you see this little like 1-2 punch over and over in film, and particularly in Hollywood. So this doesn't always mean conclusion 1 is the climactic event. So this generally means you have a climactic event, and then you have the immediate aftermath of the crisis averted, which is still falling action, which is your like ending 1. And then you have the second conclusion, which is often a hard cut in time or place to life after that conclusion. But games are not films, nor are they books. They share plenty of approaches to story structure, motif, character building, shot composition, experience, right, and different types of formats, among other formats. But one of the ways in which games really deviate from films and books is how they end. So some kinds of games are really interested in or even good at both of those kinds of endings, right? The resolution and the epilogue. But many games don't. So you have things like open world games, New Game Plus type games, mechanic focused games, board games, and perhaps like most classically, which we're going to end this talk on, tabletop role playing games in the tradition. They don't prioritize the epilogue. Obviously, there's exceptions, myriad to this rule, and there are many kinds of media inside of games and elsewhere that are not given over to the resolution epilogue format really intentionally to great effect. Like, I'm not out here arguing that this is the only way you can end a story. I actually think it's a kind of traditional and boring way to end a story at times. But I think it's really safe to say that more gameplay is generally considered a plus from a consumer perspective. So you have games that are measured in their play hours. Steam keeps track of how many hours are on record. It does that. It's one of the worst things that you see. Replaying a game in New Game Plus mode standard? And like, what does this do to our endings? Sometimes nothing. Sometimes it doesn't really change anything at all, and sometimes it changes everything to like a really big effect. I think it's worth kind of like zooming into this for a second, moving on, because there's something in here that I want to talk about with like deep specificity later, which is closure, like what it is, how it's achieved, why we pursue it as writers. You have this quote from Barbara Bernstein Smith. So she has this book, Poetic Closure, which is really interested in the point at which a poem ends, the exit of the verse for best effect, which is really important in poetry. So she finds this distinction in this book, which is so useful, between simply ending and then finding a point of conclusion. For Sophie Smith, she goes, anything can end. Events end, parties end, stories end, lives end. The experience of this talk is going to end, but only artwork and any experience that includes film and music and text and poetry, can conclude. So she's like, there's a difference between a conclusion and an ending. You also have this, which I actually didn't put there. I pulled the other one from, but you have a quote from David Richer, or fables end, which differentiates between these two kinds of closure and fable. So you have, from Richter, you have thematic completeness, where goals are achieved, events are witnessed, which is different from stylistic closure, the aesthetic pleasure of an, which is often, I think, maybe what Smith is actually pointing at in poetic closure, is there is an aesthetic pleasure to the end of the poem, like that little break, that little cut, that little moment where you kind of like take the breath back in. And so for Richter, narratives can complete themes often, but not actually have the needed device stylistically end. The inverse is also true. Fairy tales, and really in particular, and Fables End is a book on fairy tales, can really leave major plot points unresolved. So oftentimes in fairy tales, you have something set up in the beginning, it's just like never addressed again. The main character wanders off and they end up in some other place, and then the story ends. But it still works, and it works because that stylistic closure can still hit. That dual narrative structure, story and theme, asks for different kinds of resolution, and it's part of those two types of filmic closures that we looked at the top, the epilogue and the resolution. So I would make the argument the games are, on balance, pretty good at thematic completeness. They're not, even mechanically focused games, even games that are like kind of ramping up through like a roguelike upgrade progression system, are pretty good at thematic completeness, right? They can get to a point of like, oh, I understand like thematically where this game is going. And they're sometimes, but not always, great at stylistic closure. And a place where this is especially pointed is running games. And this is because they add one more possible result to that list of ways in which, games like could not really end, and that is that people that are playing them can stop playing them for whatever reason. They add a social element. So when I started working on World Ending Game, this was really a gesture at this reality as much as anything else. There's quotes of me saying things like, long-running like TTRPG campaigns are classically bad at finding their endings. Both the games themselves aren't designed to off-ramp, and because life gets in the way. So I started this project really heavily focused a lot on the material realities of a tabletop group. I mean, like, how many people in this room have had a campaign that they used to play and just sort of like stop? Yeah, yeah. Some night you say good session, and then like somehow through you're going, wait, like, what was my character doing? We were in an inn. And classically, tabletop games in campaigns end player conflict, burnout, breakups, babies, graduations, moves across the country, or sometimes simply because other campaign ideas become more exciting, right? They dwindle and fizzle as often as they explode. I'll use D&D as a baseline. I'm so partly because it's so common, but mostly because it's often people's first experience with the idea of a long-term campaign, and thus like may have specifically been the system that did die off for people, often, I think for many, somewhere in that transition from high school or college to life after being with a friend group materially, kind of like daily way. Because like, even playing even if you weren't playing D&D, right? Even playing an adventure or a supplement is a long dedication. It is requiring consistent buy-in, but also shared content, a free living room, Sunday night. These are things that are hard to give over time. And while many TTRPGs, like shoutouts to one-session games, end-of-game rule sets within larger games, many of which have, including in building games. So like it's not all it's not all dire. Many of these have mechanics for both closure and for ending. But despite all that being true, endless play style games are not on. And so, you know, if you were the advice on top on how to end a story, you're supposed to know the ending from the start. Like this is if you're like, oh my god, how do I end this long campaign? You know, how do I end a story? Everyone's like, well, you should write it first and then get there. But this is not how tabletop games work. Like it's not how they should work. This is collaborative play. You can't just know where it's all headed at the beginning. That's not the point. So it's not uncommon to see GMs or players kind of try to make this for themselves outside of the rules of play. And this can look like epilogues or what comes after, often with time skips, right? Like, what's the character doing in a year or 10 years? Free narrate. And honestly, with like a generous and a thoughtful table, this can hit all by itself, no matter the system. You don't need a supplement. If you just want to go like, all right, we're ending the story. Like, what are you up to now? What did you do with your life after? But a thing that's really, I find that's easy to forget in games is that satisfying for the character might not inherently equal satisfying to the player. And I think this actually can get kind of muddled sometimes in this genre in which embodiment is a part of play. So, you know, our characters can, but don't have to get a perfect happy ending to achieve meaningful closure. And in fact, they don't have to get an ending that makes sense to that character at all for it to make sense to the player. In pieces of media, film, literature, poetry, in which our actions and choices are not actually rated by success metrics, this can, I think, feel a little more front of mind, where you go like, do I have a horror? I know where this is going for my protagonist and miserable. But at the end of the campaign or story, we're actually kind of relinquishing first person agency over we want to win and succeed, and becoming the watcher and trying to kind of like figure out how their story ends in a way that's satisfying for us, that's distant. Because generally, this is actually not the end of the character; it's the end of our control in their life. So it's like easy to forget this, you know. It's when they stop living as us, but it's not when their world stops living for them theoretically somewhere. This is like more than anything else is I think world ending games fundamental relationship to film and also to endings in general. So there's a window, like a little lens, that closes after a set duration. We might get a coda, we might get a summary, or a gesture at like a future life of the viewed, if that character is gone. We don't have them anymore. The bridge between our and we're like closing. So world ending game is fundamentally an attempt to codify, structure, and organize around ability. And it does it in the stupidest positive way possible, which is it steals. So after sitting in the social dynamic of the end of campaign situation where people just sort of drift play for a while, like just going, okay, I want to make a game that can serve as a last session supplement, right? For as many people as need to play, with or without a GM, in person or online, text or voice, no matter how long it's been since last playing, that constrains itself to a few hours, that requires no prep or heavy lifting, that's respectful, that offers space for feeling, allows both big swings and small moments, that feels real, and that is genre agnostic. And I was like, oh, but also some of this can be rules and safety mechanics. You know, some of this can just be like, okay, we need to feel safe expressing emotion. We need rules around to like change scenes. We need a shorthand for types of play that is like very generative and quick, that require kind of like rules checking, even dice roll to an degree, just because it takes time. And this needs to be fast, feel fast. But like, where's the vibe gonna come from? Like, how do I find that shorthand? And the answer was extremely cliche movies. So I spent 6 months going down like the 30 best movie endings lists and watching them. Sometimes watching the whole film, sometimes just watching the ends, which sorry to the film critics in the room, I really am. Big hitters were exactly what you'd guess, right? Western cinema, Hollywood classic. You're talking things like Planet of the Apes, There Will Be Blood, Inception, Doctor Strangelove, Thelma and Louise, Citizen Kane, Casablanca, 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Graduate, Night of the Living Dead, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Thing, Truman Show, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, Before Sunset, right? You get the idea. These kind of like, ooh, that last movies. And sometimes like more esoteric films would wiggle their way in, like The 400 Blows, Love, or the occasional documentary. Saw on there who's good at an ending, something. But most with this very classic rhyming structure, action film. And I made lists of these kinds of endings that were deployed. Not really just like the last shot, but those last 20 minutes of the movie. After the climactic event, before the final cut, what happens in that little frame as we are having resolution and then we're having epilogue, the sort of devices that are deployed in them. And unsurprisingly, there were many, many, many repetitions. Often not specifically, right? Not every movie ends on the beach looking back at a New York City, sorry. But there were a lot of kind of, oh my God, they finally said it conversations. There were the departures from the world we've known, you know, on boats, on planes, on horses, on cars, foot, through doors. Were a lot of shots resting on items, on letters, on keys, on, oh my God, that thing that would have changed the world if only our protagonist had it, you know? The object of power. There were big cinematic deaths. There were stupid, funny, sudden, funny deaths. There were kisses. There were montages. There were time cuts, and there were songs. And I did my best to kind of align these different kinds of endings structurally and write rules around how I might generate them conversationally during. So I wanted these endings to feel like a single scene in a movie, which meant they had to be quick to play with generous but non-restrictive prompting that kept players from getting bogged down. D. Vincent Baker's really excellent Mobile Frame Zero Firebrands was a wonderful touchstone here. The dance subgame can really feel like a scene in and of itself. Another good example of this is action movie, which says right on the box, you are playing as an action movie hero and you are filming a movie as you're playing as the action movie hero. So 2 sub-levels of play inside of that tabletop game. We have the script change, the safety tool script change, which is like another really nice touchstone here. It formalizes the kind of TTRPG filmic shorthand of picking a rating for your game before you start playing as a safety device into a number of cinematic tools to kind of help edit or pause or rewind play using that language of film. And the result of this is that a lot of the endings in world-ending game are tropes, like plain and simple. And it is a miracle of the effect of translation. You don't have to be embarrassed. Instead, these become shorthand for embodying certain kinds of shots. So we all know what riding into the sunset looks like. We all know what the final aching, oh my God, they're gonna finally kiss looks like. We've all seen a jukebox musical. And when you call those endings what they are, you can apply their structures to other kinds of stories. Use a shorthand, they actually get more and not less weird. So media literacy here is a tool that we lean on in a way that lets us reach for the immediacy of scene rather than struggle with content and format and pacing and timing, because you're like, no, I know what right into this is. Like I could just do that, but I have to adapt it to the genre and the character and all the rest, and it gets weird, even though you know exactly how it's supposed to be paced. And this is common inside of genre shifts in general. The added friction of doing something cliche in a medium that is not actually the general space that generates the cliche means that the result is already strange. So you have a cliche, you know, a cliche requires repetition. But in a game like this, where we're talking about a movie, but the frame is imaginary. There is no camera. There are no cuts. The narrative voice of God does not actually cut in above the film reel. Macbeth does not fall to the ground, killed by stuff as the lights go green. We're just like saying that they do. And so the cliche becomes a lattice from which surety in yourself and your character and your agency springs from. And surety makes an eager, generous, generative play. We can call this trope grafting from one medium to another. And what this makes for is a weird, but fun and still satisfying, I think, and hope, dénouement. So fundamentally, the structure of world-building game is this. Players play their characters or other supporting characters in a game with a GM. The GM plays as the director. And as you go in a circle, players and director pick scenes among the endings, following the rules of each ending, which is like a little sub-game, finally followed by a last shot. I'm just going to go through a couple. I didn't pull in the whole book. There's 20. Some of these endings were not just pulled from film, but were also mirroring the table solutions that I'd seen right organically. So describe what you're doing in 6 months, a year, 10 years, 100 years. Like, what is the world shaped like? Flash forward, do a little cut. Others use a really specific type of Hollywood ending as a title, but gameplay text actually abstracts out, in this one, for instance, Ride into the Sunset. It's like, okay, but like, what's the ride? What's the sunset? Who's watching you? Answer some questions about like that end, that pullback. Some games really expressly rhyme the story in that way, right? Drawing to that loop. So you're going like, all right, we're gonna go in the circle, going to kind of cinch it back together like a film does. Others use things like the character sheet as a material touchstone. So, you have this in many games, not all. You have a sheet covered in items and abilities and scars, right? That are who and what you are as a character. You're able to kind of reference and use those things filmically too, much like Hitchcock loves items. There's a real like character sheet to many Hitchcock movies, especially The Last Shot. Others use music literally out loud to score scenes, to handle timing in the same way that like a musician will undercut a scene with a piece of music. So here's 2 sub games. We have Karaoke Bar, where you are literally, and we have my favorite one in the game, which is your own private fan cam and anime music, where you are selecting from subsets of prompting text to begin statements about what your character is doing as a piece of music played underneath cuts. And then some actively resettle internally to the not just to the players, that says like, okay, it's something, the actions you have taken, maybe remember, it's kind of like spinal alignment. We were talking about that little click of the ending. How does it shift the way that this is? And then finally, the structure, let me something really, really stupid, but kind of special with the GM, which was expressly give them the camera. This is something that I think comes up ambiently during play, a certain amount of shorthand for like, okay, we're gonna cut, or like, all right, I think the camera sees this other thing, because is this kind of spectator, watcher, player eye in tabletop games, it's kind of strange. You have this imaginary audience that, unless you're or an audience, is not present in tabletop games, right? Your audience is your table, but you're also the actors and you're also the director. You're kind of like trading all sources, and so you have the camera in world ending game that is expressly given to the director, to the GM, which makes it an apparent part of play, this meta play. So, when you're using the trope of this as your device, it's impossible to forget that the camera is there. So instead we hand it around, we use it to add flavor and dynamism and tension to shot, to life. We add life to the world, we allow it to kind of change our time, our focus. And then the camera actually casts the ball not just as player, but as spectator. So generally in games, films have spectators and games have agents. But world-ending game is a transition. It is about moving from an agent, active in the world, into an active spectator in the movie sense. Watching, but is also assembling story motifs into an understanding, right? Whole cloth. And that's really what world-ending game is about. It is about how play over a couple of hours and over that last 20 minutes of the movie, you're saying goodbye. And you're doing this by transitioning really slowly from a player to a spectator, and then the camera is out again. So finally, the game ends kind of not with the last ending, with this last shot. So you kind of get to choose, like, among these last shots, want to end this way. The director picks this. And then you have these 2 post-game games where you're not embodying characters at all. You get credits and you get extras, where these are optional. You don't have to play them. But the other thing a movie has is it is in a cinema, right? It's in a room like this. The lights are out, and that cut happens, the last shot, and then you stay in the theater a little while. Like the credits roll. You go like, "Ooh, how was it made? Ooh, interesting. It's really." And then you can sit there for a while, right? You can think and sit or cry or stop crying, have a little aftercare. And then eventually the lights come up and you walk out into in the dark as yourself.